Hello, BookTube. As you can see, I'm here today with a bit of a change of pace. I'm here talking to an author. And the author is Nicholas Basbanes, whose name will be known to a lot of you, uh, but who the typical thumbnail biographical note will say that he burst into prominence in 1995 with his book A Gentle Madness. It's all about, at heart, this wonderful benign obsession that we all share of the love and the buying too many of books. uh, but actually, he was a bookish journalist, a book section editor, a columnist, interviewed a baseball stadium full of authors for decades before that book came out. Which is it's got to be. I've talked to a great many authors who find it a little bit funny to realize that they burst into prominence 30 years after they started their job. But still, there were a sequence of books after that about books, about paper, the history of paper, about libraries, all the bookish subjects that we love so much. And the latest book, his latest book, new now, is this. It's Cross of Gold, his biography of the great American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, or Cross of Snow. Sorry. And he's here to talk about this and who knows what else. so hello and welcome.
Well, hey,
Welcome.
thank you. Great to be with you, and we're both a couple of pioneers here, I think, in this new way of talking about books. But here we are.
And now, I have a first question, and you have already told me that it is the first and only question that you get when this subject comes up. But I feel duty bound to ask, why on earth Henry Wadsworth Longfellow? Why on earth? You know better than anybody that as far as a poet's stock goes, John Greenleaf Whittier and maybe Rudyard Kipling are the only ones who are more permanently forgotten as poets than this author. Why? What attracted you to this subject of all subjects?
I mean, there are a number of compelling attractions for me. I think paramount is a really thorough, comprehensive look at his life had not really been produced in a great many years. And so there was that, and maybe perhaps reach a new generation of readers and admirers. I think also the fact that I had access to materials that hadn't been accessed before, particularly with respect to his second wife, Fanny Appleton Longfellow, who was kind of obliquely the subject of the focus of the title, Cross of Snow.
The title,
right. The reference refers that title. I'm sure we'll get into it in the conversation we're having, but it refers to a poem that he wrote towards the end of his life, which was never published in his lifetime, and it was a tribute to his late wife, who had died quite tragically 18 years earlier, and for reasons which we'll get into, I'm sure, offered for me a kind of architectural blueprint for the biography that I wanted to write. So there's that, and his wife and Henry. But I think fundamentally and primarily, I was angry. I mean, I felt that Longfellow had been mistreated. I don't want to go so far as to say I make allegations. I mean, that's a legal term, but I do, I think, provide documentation for the fact that he was quite mindfully cast out of the literary canon in the 20th century.
Very purposely.
Yeah, but I argue I think it can be sustained with any amount of documentation that anybody would care to be furnished. It's easily documented. He was mindfully, gleefully, spitefully, in many quarters, cast out for a number of reasons. Who knows what the reasons were, but he was a 19th century man, a 19th century poet, enormously popular, not only in the United States, but really, and not only throughout the English-speaking world. In England, he outsold Alfred Lord Tennyson, who is the reigning poet laureate, on his own turf by a measurable amount. I mean, Tennyson himself said, yes, I do very well. I make 3,000 pounds a year, but Longfellow makes 5,000 pounds a year. So, I mean, that was the measurement he applied, was, in the marketplace. But that said, he was published in easily 30 different languages, and he had admirers everywhere and throughout social strata. I mean, every demographic applies. It wasn't just the common people, as represented when he visited England in 1868, and Queen Victoria welcomed him at Windsor Castle, and she noted in her diary and in a letter to her husband's biographer that very day, she was shocked, surprised to see the domestic staff, taking vantage points, hiding behind the curtains and furniture. and trying to get a look at this visiting celebrity. And she asked them later, "Do you know who this man is?" "Of course we know who he is. That's Longfellow." And she was just so surprised that it wasn't just the dukes and the earls and the royalty and the upper strata of society. It was his popularity was throughout. So there was that, and he was beloved. And when we say beloved by every social component, by people of intelligence. I mean, he was critically acclaimed. So what happens? So what happens in the 20th century? I mean, he dies in 1888. No, and I the point, literary fashion is a slippery slope. Every writer has his or her ups and downs. You come into fashion, you go out of fashion. But when all of a sudden there's this systematic, tacit agreement in the universities, basically, when you have this wave of modernism, a new criticism that's coming in. 19th century is being purged. Or he did poetry, meter and rhythm, and where sentences rhymed, and his poems were very accessible. They're written beautifully. Children loved them. In fact, that's the kiss of death. I mean, it says you're beloved by children. I mean, how serious a poet can you be when children not only understand your poetry, but Henry, by the way, would have been thrilled by the fact that children loved his poetry. They wrote him letters, and he always responded to them. He was never insulted at all by the fact that people of every persuasion loved his work. But there was this feeling he was an easy target, and because of that celebrity, he was an easy target. You mentioned Whittier and some of the others. All right, Whittier was Whittier, but this is the top guy. If you're gonna raise your knife to kill, you might as well go for the king, right?
You're gonna restructure the canon.
If you're gonna really change the whole scene, and so you say, okay, how is it possible? How can you remove someone from the literary canon? That's ridiculous. Well, it isn't. If you control the anthologies and the textbooks and the collections, if you decide what students read in the schools, and the students are all of a sudden you're deleting him from the textbooks, which is again
that's the ball game.
I don't know about yourself, but when I was going to school, we had to memorize.
You had to memorize Longfellow, absolutely.
And you still remember some of them. All of a sudden, I talked to people; they never heard of Longfellow. They never read him.
No, if you get him out of the anthologies, that's the ball game.
So how can you stay in fashion if your poems are no longer being read? And you can document, you can prove this. I mean, it wasn't subtle. They maligned him, they insulted him, they said nasty things about him, and to that is the fact he was a very good and decent man.
That's a theme that runs throughout this book. You're championing him not just as a poet, but as a person.
Exactly. Another question I'm frequently asked in these events is, what's the biggest surprise in all of your research? Because I did a lot of research on this, about 8 years worth, And I say, if you're a professional researcher and a scholar, there are very few epiphanous surprises. I mean, because you're working, you're seeing things, and one document leads to another. But for me in this book, I guess what was not surprising so much as reassuring was just how really thoroughly decent a man he was. And it's evident, not only in the way he deals with the general public and his millions, and it is millions of admirers around the world, but how he really comports himself in his relationships with other people, in his letters, and the feelings that he has for his friends, is his loyalty to his friends. You cannot find an ill word expressed by Longfellow, and he wrote thousands of letters that survived. His journals survived. You just can't find it. And
it's amazing to me too how gracious he is.
Absolutely.
This is a guy who had a lot of things.
One of the great,
but he didn't.
One of the great resources for me in this book was not only his journals and his letters, which survive, and they are not only at Longfellow House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is managed and operated by the National Park Service, but his massive literary archive at the Houghton Library of Harvard University, which is just a half a mile away in Cambridge. So all of his literary manuscripts are there, all of his surviving correspondence. Henry was a pack rat, and his wife, they saved everything. And so much of that material, the material objects, are in the Longfellow House, but they saved every little scrap of paper, every document. So not only are you able to read literally the thousands of his letters that survive and that were gathered and archived at Harvard, but the letters that he received, there must be 11,000 letters there that Henry received from any number of different, from the famous to the common people, from 9-year-old children. A little girl in Ohio writes him a fan letter. He saves it, and his response. I mean, so you have both sides of a conversation. And he tried his darndest. You can't say he answered every letter. It's estimated he received about 20,000 letters in his life, but he tried. He really gave it, and he would say the finger of the correspondence is calling me. He has to deal. He's got a pile of letters, and not only that, people would knock at his door. They would come. He would be the person to answer the door, and occasionally he would invite them in. But if not, he had a stack of cards on the side that he had autographed. He dispensed them. So he was just a really nice and decent man. You know, he didn't really dedicate books. We all authors, for the most part, you dedicate your book to somebody. I can only find him dedicating 2 books, one to Channing, the minister, the Unitarian minister, the book on slavery, but the Seaside, he did one to his readers. He wrote a poem, about an 11-stanza poem, a poem of appreciation to his readers for the great feeling of respect and admiration that they extended to him, and he hoped that he could reciprocate it. It's the only time he dedicated a book that I could see was to the great body of readers who embraced him and admired him. So I think that's a long answer. I'm sorry, but you asked the question for the why. There were all these factors, and the fact that it was there. You know, I live in Massachusetts. Longfellow House is a National Park Service historic site. I argue it's unique in the American Inventory of Historic Parks. And you say, well, unique's a very strong word. I'm a writer. I know what the word unique means, one of a kind. And it is, because not only is it the home of a writer, but it is filled with all of the original furnishings, paintings, artifacts, cutlery. I mean, he saved everything. He saved the pencils. He has, with this pencil, I finished Evangeline. You know, with this pencil, I did Hiawatha. You know, he saved the pencil stubs. I'm sure if they knew about DNA, they probably would have saved fingernail clippings. I mean, they saved everything. They did clippings of hair. They had so as a writer, and this stuff is not only there, but it is managed by a professional staff of archivists, and that stuff was fully made available to me, and wow. So much of it. They estimate that
you're ever going to get to the man himself.
800,000. I'll give you that number again: 750 to 800,000 archival materials and objects in Longfellow House. The vast majority of which, I'm not going to say they're all dynamite items, but you know, as a writer, and if you've got time and if you've got patience, you go through these things and you begin to build a profile, and not only with documents but with things, and really help you to see people in the 19th century. And it was such a thrilling experience for me to go and to be able to step into this house. And every time I went in there, there's a feeling, because not only was it Longfellow's house for 50 years, and it's a magnificent colonial mansion for people who don't know it. You know, go to Longfellow, do a Google and go to the National Park Service website for Longfellow House. I mean, that's not a pitch for my book. Go and look at what it is. It's an amazing site that in good times, when we're at a time now when it's closed to visitors, but you go and you visit it, and they have professional guides will show you around. And it's an amazing place. It's not just the home of Longfellow, but in the 18th century, it was the command headquarters and official residence of George Washington during the siege of Boston. So it has historic relevance not only for the 18th century and during the Revolution, but pretty much throughout the 19th century, when it was the home and gathering place for just about everything that goes on in this book. So I like to think of this house really as a third major character, unstated in the book. But the house, I think you'll agree. You've read the book and read it, by the way. Thank you for that wonderful review. Very
it's my pleasure.
Review. It's a pleasure to be seated with a person who's read the book and has really wonderful questions.
Been to the house too many times.
Anyway, but so there you have it. So for all those reasons, you know, that's why I did the book.
Would you say, when I was reading this, I was thinking, is it possible that this is the first biography of Longfellow to be written in the mind frame of him being forgotten? All the major biographies before this just assumed that he would always be there, right? That that he
Well,
was. I mean, you go back to Newton Arvin or the poet's own brother. They just assumed he was a massive figure and always would be. It,
I,
is yours?
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, that's a tough assumption to make that somebody's always going to be there, you know. But the Newton Arvin book was in the '60s. I think you mentioned that one in your review. It's a terrific review.
Right.
And he did that and he was an outstanding literary critic. And for a lot of personal reasons that we don't need to get into, but he had a tough time. He was a teacher at Smith College, and he was really unfairly maligned and attacked, and he suffered a great deal unjustly. And there's been a book written about it for those who are interested in knowing more. But for reasons, I think, for his own well-being, his emotional well-being, he turned to Longfellow. Then he wrote that really wonderful critical book, 1966 or 68, I think it is.
Yeah.
And
I remember exactly when it was.
If I have one criticism of it, and it's very minor, but when you read the book, it's because he was such a towering literary critic and of many other writers. But this is what you find in the 20th century. You find him almost apologizing for writing about Longfellow.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
I said, oh, why
you don't? You very much don't
apologize. Don't apologize. You're doing a good thing. You don't have to explain yourself in my eyes. You know, right. I'm slumming. I'm doing Longfellow. Please, you know, I'm already tenured. You can't take away my professorship. I mean, you know, and I see that. Steve, I did a lot of research for this book. You know, JSTOR. Are you familiar with JSTOR? This, you know, I have an inventory of over 1,000 JSTOR articles just for this Longfellow book, and I get PDFs of them all, and I save them, and I give them names. And so, I mean, I could put together a list of scholarly articles that were written about Longfellow, and so many of them. You'll find an occasional one in the 20th century, and they apologize. They say, well, you know, why are you apologizing? I mean, I could write a paper on it. I could document it. I'm telling you, I'm not just blowing smoke on this. Definitely provable. So that aside, I think with the dismissal of Longfellow, people just didn't write about him. And the fact that he wasn't being taught in the academy. Thankfully, you know, I'm not by no means the first. I mean, I'm part of a movement to restore him. You know, Christoph Irmscher, who wrote the wonderful review of my book on the Wall Street Journal.
Boy,
it was that something.
Oh, I mean, man,
if you don't
so
another
good.
review, you know, just say that's you don't need another one. That's but I had wonderful reviews also in other media. I mean, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Boston Globe. So they've all reviewed it. I love your review. Let me say, it was right on point. Anyway, but that aside. There was a movement, and Christoph was part of it, starting, I would say, back in the 1990s or so. Dana Gioia, you've heard of Dana Gioia. He was a poet laureate out in California. He was a director of the National Endowment for the Arts, and also a big Longfellow fan. And he wrote Longfellow in the Age of Modernism. Actually, it's basically what we're talking about. And that was published in a very important anthology. I think it was the Columbia Encyclopedia of American Poetry. And he wrote a really very important essay on looking again at Longfellow. Please, he argued, don't dismiss this man. The great Daniel Aaron, who died a couple of years ago at the age of 103, he was the founding president of the Library of America and a great champion of Longfellow. By the way, a very close friend of Newton Arvin. They taught together at Smith before Dan Aaron came to Harvard. And he wrote, I think, the best essay in this whole thing. And if anyone wants to see it, contact me through your website. I'll direct you to it. Daniel Aaron's essay on Longfellow's problematic legacy in the 20th century. But there's one resonant line in there that he has. And he said, Longfellow is much too good. Well, actually, no, it's another way. He said, American literature is not that rich that we can afford to dismiss a writer as good as Longfellow. Shame on us if we dismiss a writer this good. You know, who says he, listen, is he better than Whitman? Is he better than Emily Dickinson? Who cares? I'm not going to say that he is or he isn't. Why does it have to be one or the other? You know, why do you have to say Whitman, Dickinson, Poe, you know?
Right.
But dismiss Longfellow.
Especially if it's not organic.
I don't mean to be
the point
fighting
you make in this book is that it's not organic. the process isn't organic, that it was done intentionally.
So
if the mores of the time had left him behind, that would be one thing. But
exactly.
You argue convincingly that isn't true.
Well, that's my argument. I say, if he dies of natural causes, he dies of natural causes. Happens to all of us, We all meet our fate. But I found his dismissal a little more systematic and a little more malicious, frankly, for my taste. And I've reached a point in my life as a writer. You mentioned my first book. In fact, we're in August. It's celebrating its 25th anniversary this month. Gentle Madness is 25 years old. Who would have thought? And I was 52 years old when I published my first book. So do the math. I'm 77, and I've had 10 books, and that was the first. This is the 10th. And I feel that I've reached a stage in my life where I want to write about somebody I want to write about. I'm not that I didn't want to write about the other subjects. I did. Every subject I embraced, but this one in particular, I said I really want to do.
This one seems like an outlier.
Yeah, and I like this guy, and I admire his work, and I was really taken by the story of his wife, the relationship. I mean, who really knew about this courtship that lasted 7 years and the rejection?
And that's what you meant, right?
And,
when you said
that's how he writes this novel where she's a character, and he thinks this is going to help his chances, and it absolutely devastates it. And so there was that wonderful story, and the fact that she was such an intellectual partner for him. People say, oh, she was this socialite, and her father was Nathan Appleton, the founder of Lowell, Massachusetts, who incidentally, as a wedding present, purchased for them the house, what is now known as Longfellow House. That was the wedding present, with the furnishings. And because there's a wonderful letter. She says, Father, if you're going to go ahead and buy us the house, this is 1843, perhaps we should get the land in front that goes down to the Charles River, because in time, maybe other houses will be built there and we'll lose the view. And you say, oh, well, he did. He bought that land. But thankfully, you've got that beautiful Longfellow Park now, open space. The house right down to the Charles River. It's magnificent, so it's very foresighted on her part. But so there's that. People say, oh, he married well and he lived in luxury and all that. He lived well. But that was not the attraction. The attraction was her mind. Henry Longfellow could read. There were 12,000 books in that house, and he knew them all. And they read them all. But there were 12,000 books and many more that went to Harvard. So over the years, there were probably as many as 20,000. That's a lot of books. But in 45 dialects in 15 languages. We haven't even touched upon here his accomplishments and his contributions as a linguist, and the years he spent in Europe. He fresh out of Bowdoin College. He graduated from Bowdoin at the age of 18. In 1825, and within 2 or 3 days of his graduation, he was offered a position as a full professor of modern languages at Bowdoin to be the 4th college in the United States to teach modern European languages. It was Harvard, William and Mary, and UVA who were already teaching these languages. They got a bequest to do this. But who's going to teach these languages? Who knows them? Nobody. So the deal was, you could be the professor of modern languages, but first you have to go to Europe and learn them before you can teach them. And he does. And so he sails for Europe at the age of 19, the chapter Awakening, where he becomes a young man. He goes from being a teenager to an adult in that chapter, in my view. And not only does he learn these languages and does he absorb, the cultures of all these countries that he's traveling through, but he does these wonderful self-portraits of himself. There he is in Spain on a horse, and he's in Spanish garb, and there he is in Italy. And now in Italy, he's Enrico, and he falls in love with a woman, a very bright woman who's his teacher, who teaches him. Well, she's a teacher. Let's leave it that way. But all I'm saying is he becomes a young man, and in every respect, and you see the great respect he has for women, beginning from that age, and it goes throughout his life. But he always, what he's looking for most of all is an intellectual companion. And in Fanny Appleton, he met his match. I mean, he could speak.
That really comes out in his book.
Half a dozen of her own, and I think he said the most thrilling, rewarding time of every day of his life. They were married for 18 years. I mean, he pursued her for 7, But finally, when they become a man and wife and they move into this house, they're never separated. He's invited to come to Europe, or he's asked by a correspondent in Europe, do you think you might be coming to visit at some point, and will you be bringing your wife? And he writes back, well, I'd like to think we might come, but of course, if I come, I will bring my wife. He said, because part of our theory of life is we must never be separated. And it really, which is why there is not a large body of correspondence between Henry and Fanny. Because for 7 years of the so-called courtship, in quotation marks, there were no letters exchanged. I mean, she wasn't speaking to him. And then once they were married, they were never separated. But there are 9 letters that I was able to document, several of which are exceedingly important, one of which has never been quoted before anywhere. I mean, in a book. It's in my book for the first time. Her acceptance of his proposal, which is for reasons of propriety, presumed propriety, Victorian propriety. Anything that has anything to do with passion, I guess, and emotional involvement was considered, untouchable. But she was very, very passionate in her response and accepting his proposal. And for reasons, whatever, hadn't been published until now. It's no big deal, but if you really want it is a big deal, actually. But if you want
it's a big deal, absolutely.
Let me correct myself on that one. But that relationship was so powerful. And to just finish the thought, the greatest time of the day for him was when they read together as a couple at night. And one sketch that he made of her survives from 1846, maybe 1847. And one sketch she made of him survives. And they're both in the study. And during the evening reading hours, he's relaxing. And the other one, she's she's resting. And he said the first thing he noticed about her was her voice, her musical, because sound. He loved music. He loved opera. And the first thing he noticed about her, even wrote about her, was the musical sound of her voice. And her reading to him at night became the highlight of every day. It's a wonderful story. He was going into Boston on crossing the Charles River in a carriage. He's going in for some lecture, who knows, somewhere. He's wanted everywhere. Halfway across the bridge, he tells the driver to stop, turn around, and go back to Cambridge. He said, basically, am I nuts? I'm going to miss out on reading with my wife for a lecture that I don't want to attend in Boston. Stopped, turned around, went home for the reading. They were inseparable, and she was a nutrient. That's one of the words I use. Is she was a nutrient to his creative process. She helped. Was she a collaborator? I can't say. I mean, the evidence doesn't support that. She did give him ideas for a number of poems, and she read everything, and she comments critically on so many things, and she's fully aware of what he's doing, and she goes over with him. He shows her everything that he writes, and that really hadn't been documented before. I thought that was an important thing to write about.
No, it's by far the fullest portrait of her.
Yeah, and she has never been written about, by the way, to any extent before this book. I mean, she's been written about, but when she dies in that frightful accident in 1861, then she disappears usually from the narrative. But I have her here not only for
she's usually largely invisible to the narrative before that too.
Yeah, not in this book. Yeah,
not in this book. No, in this book, you're right. She is the third character here. The house, him, and her.
This could almost be called a dual biography. I mean, it says a life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It very definitely is what it is. But it's also a life of Frances Elizabeth Appleton Longfellow, who she's 10 years younger than he, so she doesn't enter until chapter 4. But when you meet her for the first time, I really designed the book to have kind of a dueling, not dueling, but opposing narratives that would kind of converge, which I was able to do because of the rich correspondence. One of the great things about writing about in the 19th century is they wrote magnificent letters, and they survive. And I like to quote people. I like to hear people's voices. All of my books, yes. I really allow the way you're allowing me to talk today. This is how thank you. This is how I like to hear people talk. I want to hear what they have to say. And Henry and Fanny, I allow them to speak and tell my readers.
Yeah, in this book, you often just step back.
I step back. Obviously, I'm selective. I'm not giving you a transcription. I'm being very selective. but they were such beautiful writers. You just allow them to to speak for themselves. It was really great.
So what would your what would your if we're going to wrap this up, what would your elevator pitch be to, for instance, young Americans who
Now, what would
never
my
were exposed
I'm
to this
sorry,
book?
please? What would my what?
What would your elevator pitch be? The classic Hollywood elevator pitch. What is, apart from reading the book, which of course you should all do? What your case is that
My
why
take is that it's the 19th century was compelling. He was born in 1807 and he died in 1882. And he responds and she responds. And I think if you're interested in life in the 19th century, the 18 years of their marriage, which was tragically cut short in July of 1861, just a few months after the beginning of the Civil War. But you also see, I also try to give you a profile and a portrait of the United States of America in exceedingly tumultuous and consequential times, and the years leading up to the Civil War, and how they are responding. And we haven't even talked about his friends, Charles Sumner and Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Mutual Admiration Society. And Sumner is his closest friend, who's the number one abolitionist in the land. And Sumner gets beaten to within a few inches of his life on the Senate floor after giving the Crime Against Kansas speech. And how do they respond to this? And how is Henry responding in his poetry to what's going on around him? Because it's often said, oh, he didn't write about what was going on in the world, and that's baloney.
It's baloney. Yes, it's very often said that he was in
Don't
some
you
sort
think
of power.
So? When he writes the building of the ship, and he says, "Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great." He's talking about the United States of America at these perilous times. And when he writes Paul Revere's Ride, which is published, I mean, the very same day that the Civil War is about, the states are seceding. When he says born in the, I can't do it from direct memory, but when we talk about the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. He's talking not about the American Revolution.
He's not talking about the American Revolution.
The tense is very clear. It's future. And it's right now. And you're really going to break up this union don't tell me he's not writing about what's going on around him. And he did write a volume, by the way, which was published in 1842 called On Slavery. So people say he didn't write about direct himself. He did. He wrote 7 poems on slavery, which was published, the first volume of poetry by any American on the subject. And it was consequential enough that it was deleted from an edition of his works in Philadelphia, and that was, and so that he did make a stand in that particular regard. And so there's a lot to learn about him. There's a consequential man during consequential times.
A consequential man during consequential times. Yes.
And a decent man, and a heck of a good story. Because I'm driven by, if there's one component that fuses all of my books, as far as I'm concerned, is that it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. It's all about storytelling.
It has to be a good
narrative. I want you to pick this book up. I want you to get into it, and I want you to enjoy it, and I want you to read it. Please read it all the way through. And if you do that, a writer can't ask for any more than that, really.
I think that most of the people who've read your books would agree with me that you could make a good story out of a plank of wood. But I understand your point that you want to start with good material. That's why Whittier didn't get the nod.
That's exactly right. Whittier asked Henry, after he published that volume of poems on slavery, he actually approached him to run for Congress. Because that's how important that those poems were seen. And Longfellow said, "No, I do not march under any. My feelings are known; they're clear. I'm an abolitionist. I'm anti-slavery, and I have these feelings." But his calling was, he was a bard. He was a poet.
He was a bard,
and he reached to people in other more subtle ways, and I think very compelling ways that resonate today. When that stanza from the building of the ship was read to Abraham Lincoln, he started to cry. That's documented. Tears came to his eyes. And when England stood alone against Nazi Germany, and Churchill hadn't yet met Franklin Roosevelt takes pen to paper and writes out from memory that stanza: "Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, humanity without whatever, I can't do it." And he has Wendell Willkie take it and deliver it. Man, he recently defeated for president and delivered personally to Churchill, who reads it to the BBC and reads it before Parliament. And so tell me that's not a poem that didn't have legs 100 years or so after it was written. So he's a good one, and he's a very, and I loved making his acquaintance and the acquaintance of his wife, and I hope other people do too. And thanks for giving me the time on your program, Steve.
It's my pleasure. I don't think you could get a more passionate advocacy of this figure. If that doesn't do it, I don't know what will. So there you go.
Thanks for holding.
We're going to wrap this up.
I couldn't ask for.
I never got the finished copy from the publisher. The publishers are, of course, in disarray. So
you know that photograph of Margaret Cameron, that was taken during his trip to England, and it was just about a week after he had met with the Queen, and he was visiting with Tennyson, and Tennyson took him out, and I love that picture because that's the Longfellow known to the world.
Right.
I wanted to show you the Longfellow before he grew the beard, before he burned his face in that fire. And people will have to read the book to find out about that. And the Longfellow that was known to his two wives, because he had two wives and they both died tragically. So the man dealt with grief in many, many ways, but he never let the world see it. He wrote a letter once he said to the outside world, I am a person of calm, but inward I'm bleeding to death, he writes. But he had 5 children. His commitment was to them and to be the Bard of Brattle Street, as I like to think.
The Bard of Brattle Street.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
a phrase.
That is wonderful. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much. It's been fun. Maybe we'll do it
sometime. Stay safe and sound here in the pandemic. And we'll talk later. Yes.
Great. I look forward to it, Steve. Thanks for doing it.